My husband shattered a heavy crystal glass of aged bourbon right at my feet in front of 50 of Atlanta's most elite socialites. Useless woman, he sneered so loudly, the jazz band actually stopped playing. He told everyone I was a pathetic charity case he had rescued from the projects, and that I would be drowning in debt without him. What Marcus did not know was that I was a covert forensic accountant for federal agencies, and I secretly owned the very mansion he was standing in. Before I tell you how I smiled in his face while preparing to wipe out his entire financial existence, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain while dealing with a toxic narcissist. The rhythmic bass line of a live jazz quartet pulsed through our sprawling Buckhead estate. It was our annual end-of-summer gala, an extravagant display of wealth and status, meant to impress the board of directors from Marcus's investment firm. Women dripping in borrowed diamonds and men in bespoke suits filled the grand parlor. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted appetizers. From the outside, my life looked like a modern Cinderella story. Marcus constantly reminded everyone that he had met me when I was supposedly drowning in debt, working late shifts just to survive. He painted himself as the generous savior who pulled a naive girl out of the hood and gave her a life of unimaginable luxury. What he did not know was that my supposed poverty was a carefully crafted cover. I specialized in crisis risk management and forensic accounting, tracking dirty money for the most powerful people in the country. I was the person who knew where all the bodies were buried in the financial world. My marriage to Marcus was not a rescue mission. It was an assignment that had turned deeply personal. Over the years, I had watched him steal, lie, and cheat his way to the top, all while using me as a prop to boost his fragile ego. I played the part perfectly, wearing the simple beige dresses he picked out, keeping my head down and letting him feel like a king. I navigated through the maze of Atlanta's elite, balancing a heavy Baccarat crystal tumbler filled with Marcus's favorite aged bourbon. He had strict, absurd rules when he entertained. One of them was that his drink needed to be refreshed exactly on the hour. I had been detained in the kitchen by the catering staff, making me precisely 2 minutes late. I could see him from across the room holding court near the grand fireplace. He was wearing his tailored charcoal suit, his gold watch catching the light as he laughed loudly at a joke someone made. He looked like the picture of success, a man who had everything under control. But the moment his eyes locked onto mine, the charismatic smile vanished, replaced by a sharp, dark sneer. I approached him, extending my hand to offer the drink. Marcus did not reach for the glass. Instead, he stepped forward and intentionally swatted his hand outward, striking my wrist with deliberate force. The heavy crystal flew from my grasp and shattered violently against the imported Italian marble floor. Amber liquid splashed across my bare calves and soaked into the hem of my silk dress. Sharp fragments of glass scattered across the pristine floor like broken ice. The music seemed to fade into a muffled hum. The ambient chatter of the party died instantly as 50 wealthy guests turned their heads to stare at us. The silence in the massive room was deafening. I could feel the collective weight of their judgment, their pity, their morbid curiosity. "You useless woman!" Marcus laughed, his voice booming in the sudden quiet of the parlor. He looked around at his colleagues, ensuring he had their full attention before he continued his verbal assault. "You cannot even manage the simple task of bringing me a drink on time. I guess I expect too much from someone of your background." He sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "You should remember that if I had not picked you out from that miserable housing project, you would still be drowning in debt right now, probably cleaning houses for a living. I pay for the roof over your head, I buy the clothes on your back, and this is the thanks I get. You are a complete and utter embarrassment to me." He waited for the tears. He wanted the frantic apologies, the trembling voice, the desperate pleas for forgiveness. He needed me to shrink so he could look tall in front of his wealthy friends. He thrived on humiliating me, using my supposed low status to elevate his own fragile ego. He thought that breaking me down in public would solidify his dominance, proving to his colleagues that he was a man of immense power who commanded total obedience in his household. But I did not cry, I did not apologize, I did not even flinch. I stood perfectly still, my face a mask of absolute cold calm. I looked down at the ruined dress, then up at his smug, arrogant face. My eyes locked onto his, sharp and unblinking. I just stared at him, letting the heavy silence stretch out. I did not move a single muscle, simply freezing him in my gaze, while the shattered glass lay between us. I let him bask in his false sense of power, completely unaware that his perfect world was already built on a foundation of lies that I controlled. The bourbon was sticky against my skin. The sharp scent of alcohol quickly overpowered the expensive floral arrangements scattered around the grand parlor. No one in the room moved a single muscle. The elite society of Atlanta simply watched, holding their collective breath, to see if I would drop to my knees and start scrubbing the Italian marble. That was exactly what Marcus wanted. He wanted a public submission. He wanted me to scramble around on the floor like the desperate, grateful charity case he always claimed I was. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. I could see the board members from his investment firm shifting uncomfortably in their bespoke suits. I could see the wives of local politicians whispering behind their champagne flutes. They were all complicit in this cruelty by their silence. They were waiting for the show to finish. Before the uncomfortable quiet could stretch any further, the sharp rhythmic clicking of designer heels broke the tension. The crowd parted like the Red Sea to make way for my sister-in-law. Chloe was the wife of Marcus' older brother Trey. She glided across the room in a pale pink silk gown, looking desperately concerned. Chloe was a woman who wore her southern hospitality like a loaded weapon. She loved to play the savior. As a wealthy white woman who had married into a prominent black family, she constantly performed a highly curated version of allyship. She attended all the right charity galas, posted the right social justice quotes on her feeds, and always made sure to be seen doing the right things. But behind closed doors and wrapped in syrupy sweet accents, her prejudice was suffocating. She thrived on pointing out my supposed lack of pedigree. She used her proximity to our family to mask her deep-rooted superiority complex. Chloe's face was a masterclass in manufactured pity. She gasped, bringing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest as she surveyed the shattered crystal and the puddle of amber liquid at my feet. Instead of offering me a real towel or asking if the flying glass had cut my legs, she zeroed in on the narrative Marcus had just established. She wanted to twist the knife while pretending to apply a bandage. That was her specialty. She crouched down, being incredibly careful to gather her expensive silk skirt so it would not touch the spilled bourbon or the dirty floor. She reached over to a nearby appetizer tray and pulled a single cheap paper cocktail napkin from beneath a silver platter. With exaggerated gentle motions, she began to dab at the hem of my ruined dress. "Oh, Marcus, honey, you have to be understanding," she cooed, her voice intentionally pitched loud enough so that every single guest in the massive parlor could hear her performance. "You cannot be so harsh with her." She looked up at me with eyes full of fake sympathy, letting out a soft, condescending sigh. "You have to remember where Naomi comes from. In the neighborhood she grew up in, people probably only drink from cheap plastic cups. How on earth would she know how to properly handle a heavy baccarat crystal glass? It is a completely different world for her." She patted my ankle, leaving a sticky residue from the wet paper napkin. "Poor thing. It must be so exhausting for her trying to fit in here. I keep telling you, Marcus, you really should just listen to Trey and me. We can loan you some money to hire a professional maid. That way Naomi does not have to strain herself trying to blend in with your colleagues. It is simply not fair to expect her to know our ways." The absolute audacity of her words hung heavily in the air. The microaggression was executed with surgical precision. She managed to call me uneducated, uncivilized, and a glorified servant, all while presenting herself to the crowd as a compassionate peacemaker. I glanced over her shoulder and saw Trey standing a few feet away. He was swirling the ice in his drink, looking vaguely uncomfortable, but saying absolutely nothing to stop his wife. That was the dynamic of this entire family. They fed off each other cruelty. They protected their wealth and status by stepping on anyone they deemed beneath them, reinforcing their own power by tearing others down. What Chloe did not know, what none of them knew, was the exact state of Trey and Chloe's supposedly untouchable trust fund. Chloe loved to act like royalty, parading around with her generational wealth and bragging about her family legacy. She treated everyone from the valet drivers to the waitstaff like they were invisible. But as the forensic accountant who spent long nights monitoring the shadow ledgers of Marcus Holding Company, I knew exactly where Trey had been investing her family money. Trey had poured every liquid asset they possessed into Marcus offshore shell corporations. They were completely leveraged. They were drowning in phantom equity built on fraudulent tax returns and illegal wire transfers. Chloe was crouching on the floor, insulting my background while I held the digital keys that could freeze her entire net worth with a single keystroke. She was essentially a beggar insulting the bank vault. I knew that by tomorrow morning those expensive designer heels she was wearing would be purchased on a credit card that would be declined. Her entire identity was wrapped up in money that no longer actually existed. I looked down at her fake, sympathetic smile, feeling the sharp edges of the broken glass resting against the sole of my shoe. Slowly, gracefully, I bent my knees and crouched down right in front of her. I ignored the soggy paper napkin she was holding out to me. I reached past her perfectly manicured hand and picked up the largest, sharpest piece of the broken baccarat crystal. The edges were jagged and highly dangerous, catching the light from the massive chandelier overhead. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the multifaceted surface glimmer in the dim lighting of the room. I looked closely at the surface of the crystal. Warped and distorted in the reflection of the glass, I could see Marcus and Chloe. They looked exactly like what they truly were, grotesque caricatures of themselves. Marcus standing tall behind us with his chest puffed out, fueled by his own arrogant rage and deep-seated insecurities. Chloe crouching beside me wearing her mask of poisonous pity, holding onto her false sense of superiority. They were so confident in their dominance. They were so certain that they had won the evening and put me perfectly back into my place. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of submission or embarrassment. It was a smile of absolute terrifying clarity. I saw Chloe's eyes widen slightly. Her fake sympathetic expression faltered instantly as she saw the look in my eyes. She expected to see a broken woman fighting back tears. She expected to see shame. But she found only cold, hard ice. She leaned back slightly, pulling her silk dress tighter around her legs, as if she suddenly realized she was standing too close to a fire. I dropped the jagged piece of crystal right back into the puddle of bourbon, letting it splash softly against the marble. I left the mess exactly as it was. I stood up, smoothing the front of my ruined silk dress with slow, deliberate hands. I did not say a single word to Chloe. I locked eyes with Marcus one last time, letting him see the complete lack of fear and respect in my expression. The anger in his face flickered, turning into a brief flash of confusion. He did not know how to handle a victim who refused to play the assigned part. Then I turned my back on both of them. I walked through the silent crowd, my head held high, my posture perfectly straight. I did not rush. I did not run. I glided through the grand parlor, leaving Marcus and Chloe standing in their own toxic mess. The guests parted for me, stepping aside in complete silence. I walked out the heavy mahogany doors of the parlor, letting them close softly behind me, leaving the fake sympathy, the arrogant sneers, and their crumbling empire completely behind. Before the suffocating quiet could stretch any further, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels broke the tension. The crowd of wealthy socialites parted like the Red Sea to make way for my sister-in-law. Chloe was the wife of Marcus' older brother Trey, and she glided across the parlor in a pale pink silk gown, looking desperately concerned. Chloe was a woman who wore her southern hospitality like a loaded weapon. She loved to play the savior. As a wealthy white woman, who had married into a prominent black family, she constantly performed a highly curated version of allyship. She attended all the right charity galas, posted the right social justice quotes on her feeds, and always made sure to be seen doing the politically correct things. But behind closed doors and wrapped in syrupy sweet accents, her prejudice was suffocating. She thrived on pointing out my supposed lack of pedigree. She used her proximity to our family to mask her deep-rooted superiority complex. Chloe's face was a masterclass in manufactured pity. She gasped, bringing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest as she surveyed the shattered crystal and the puddle of amber liquid at my feet. Instead of offering me a real towel or asking if the flying glass had cut my legs, she zeroed in on the narrative Marcus had just established. She wanted to twist the knife while pretending to apply a bandage. That was her specialty. She crouched down, being incredibly careful to gather her expensive silk skirt so it would not touch the spilled bourbon or the dirty floor. She reached over to a nearby appetizer tray and pulled a single cheap paper cocktail napkin from beneath a silver platter. With exaggerated gentle motions, she began to dab at the hem of my ruined dress. "Oh, Marcus, honey, you have to be understanding." She cooed, her voice intentionally pitched loud enough so that every single guest in the massive parlor could hear her performance. "You cannot be so harsh with her." She looked up at me with eyes full of fake sympathy, letting out a soft, condescending sigh. "You have to remember where Naomi comes from. In the neighborhood she grew up in, people probably only drink from cheap plastic cups. How on earth would she know how to properly handle a heavy baccarat crystal glass? It is a completely different world for her." She patted my ankle, leaving a sticky residue from the wet paper napkin. "Poor thing, it must be so exhausting for her trying to fit in here. I keep telling you, Marcus, you really should just listen to Trey and me. We can loan you some money to hire a professional maid. That way Naomi does not have to strain herself trying to blend in with your colleagues. It is simply not fair to expect her to know our ways." The absolute audacity of her words hung heavily in the air. The microaggression was executed with surgical precision. She managed to call me uneducated, uncivilized, and a glorified servant, all while presenting herself to the crowd as a compassionate peacemaker. I glanced over her shoulder and saw Trey standing a few feet away. He was swirling the ice in his drink, looking vaguely uncomfortable, but saying absolutely nothing to stop his wife. That was the dynamic of this entire family. They fed off each other cruelty. They protected their wealth and status by stepping on anyone they deemed beneath them, reinforcing their own power by tearing others down. What Chloe did not know, what none of them knew, was the exact state of Trey and Chloe's supposedly untouchable trust fund. Chloe loved to act like royalty, parading around with her generational wealth and bragging about her family legacy. She treated everyone from the valet drivers to the waitstaff like they were invisible. But as the forensic accountant who spent long nights monitoring the shadow ledgers of Marcus Holding Company, I knew exactly where Trey had been investing her family money. Trey had poured every liquid asset they possessed into Marcus offshore shell corporations. They were completely leveraged. They were drowning in phantom equity built on fraudulent tax returns and illegal wire transfers. Chloe was crouching on the floor insulting my background while I held the digital keys that could freeze her entire net worth with a single keystroke. She was essentially a beggar insulting the bank vault. I knew that by tomorrow morning those expensive designer heels she was wearing would be purchased on a credit card that would be declined. Her entire identity was wrapped up in money that no longer actually existed. I looked down at her fake sympathetic smile, feeling the sharp edges of the broken glass resting against the sole of my shoe. Slowly, gracefully, I bent my knees and crouched down right in front of her. I ignored the soggy paper napkin she was holding out to me. I reached past her perfectly manicured hand and picked up the largest, sharpest piece of the broken baccarat crystal. The edges were jagged and highly dangerous, catching the light from the massive chandelier overhead. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the multifaceted surface glimmer in the dim lighting of the room. I looked closely at the surface of the crystal. Warped and distorted in the reflection of the glass, I could see Marcus and Chloe. They looked exactly like what they truly were, grotesque caricatures of themselves. Marcus standing tall behind us with his chest puffed out, fueled by his own arrogant rage and deep-seated insecurities. Chloe crouching beside me wearing her mask of poisonous pity, holding on to her false sense of superiority. They were so confident in their dominance. They were so certain that they had won the evening and put me perfectly back into my place. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of submission or embarrassment. It was a smile of absolute terrifying clarity. I saw Chloe's eyes widen slightly. Her fake sympathetic expression faltered instantly as she saw the look in my eyes. She expected to see a broken woman fighting back tears. She expected to see shame. But she found only cold, hard ice. She leaned back slightly, pulling her silk dress tighter around her legs, as if she suddenly realized she was standing too close to a fire. I dropped the jagged piece of crystal right back into the puddle of bourbon, letting it splash softly against the marble. I left the mess exactly as it was. I stood up, smoothing the front of my ruined silk dress with slow, deliberate hands. I did not say a single word to Chloe. I locked eyes with Marcus one last time, letting him see the complete lack of fear and respect in my expression. The anger in his face flickered, turning into a brief flash of confusion. He did not know how to handle a victim who refused to play the assigned part. Then I turned my back on both of them. I walked through the silent crowd, my head held high, my posture perfectly straight. I did not rush. I did not run. I glided through the grand parlor, leaving Marcus and Chloe standing in their own toxic mess. The guests parted from me, stepping aside in complete silence. I headed straight for the heavy mahogany doors of the foyer, ready to leave this charade behind forever. But before I could reach the sanctuary of the front entrance, another figure stepped directly into my path, blocking my exit. It was Vivian, my mother-in-law. Vivian was the first lady of the largest megachurch in Atlanta. A woman who preached grace and forgiveness on Sunday mornings, but practiced ruthless elitism every other day of the week. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored emerald suit, draped in heavy pearls, with her hair perfectly coiffed. She viewed herself as the ultimate matriarch of Southern high society, and she viewed me as a permanent stain on her family pristine image. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on the bourbon-soaked hem of my dress and the damp spots on my calves. Her eyes were like flint, completely devoid of any maternal warmth or basic human empathy. "Look at you," she whispered, her voice a harsh hiss meant only for my ears. A walking disaster. I told my son 1,000 times he should have married the daughter of the federal judge. She understood pedigree. She understood what it takes to uphold a family legacy in this community. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest, her diamond rings flashing in the foyer light. Instead, he brought home a charity case with no parents, no connections, and clearly, no class. You are forbidden from stepping foot in the main dining room tonight. Go out through the servant entrance and clean yourself up before the smell of cheap liquor and your cheap perfume permanently ruins my Persian rugs. You bring nothing but shame to the life we have built. Vivian stood tall, waiting for me to wither under her harsh reprimand. She expected me to lower my head and scurry away through the back door just like a disobedient child. But looking at her, I felt a profound sense of closure. I realized that not a single person in this family was worth saving. They were all complicit. They were all rotten to the core, hiding their corruption behind expensive suits and church donations. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply gave Vivian a slight mocking bow of my head. "Enjoy your evening, Vivian," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady. "It will be a night you never forget." I sidestepped the older woman and pushed open the massive front doors. The cool night air hit my face, instantly washing away the suffocating scent of the gala. The valet brought my car around, immediately sensing the urgency in my stride. I slid into the driver's seat of my sleek black sedan, and the heavy doors of the mansion slammed shut behind me, locking away the grand facade for good. I put the car in park and locked the doors. The performance was finally over. I reached under the driver's seat, pressing my fingers against a hidden magnetic latch. A small compartment dropped open, revealing a secondary highly encrypted smartphone. It was a device that Marcus had no idea existed, a direct line to the shadow world I truly operated in. I powered it on, and the biometric scanner recognized my fingerprint instantly. I opened a secure messaging app, my thumb hovering over the glowing screen. For 3 years I had gathered the evidence. I had mapped out every illegal wire transfer, every bribe, every fraudulent tax return, and every hidden offshore account connected to Marcus and his family. I had complete access to the financial networks that kept their empire afloat. They thought they controlled me, but I held the digital keys to their entire existence. I looked through the windshield, watching the warm glow of the mansion lights illuminating the manicured lawn. I could faintly hear the jazz band starting up again inside the party, continuing as if nothing had happened. They were probably toasting to their wealth and mocking my departure right at this very moment. I smiled and typed a single decisive message to my covert team at the agency. "It is time. Initiate Order 404. Freeze their entire system." I hit send. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and shifted the car into drive. The tires gripped the asphalt as I accelerated down the sweeping driveway, my headlights piercing the darkness of the Atlanta night. As my car sped away, leaving the estate in the rearview mirror, I knew exactly what was about to happen. By midnight, their bank accounts would be locked. By morning, federal agents would be seizing their assets. I left the ticking time bomb behind me, driving into the night as the ultimate architect of their destruction. The harsh mechanical buzzing of a cell phone vibrated violently against the polished mahogany nightstand. It was exactly 6 in the morning. The sprawling Buckhead estate was dead silent, wrapped in the heavy lingering scent of stale cigar smoke and spilled bourbon from the gala the night before. Marcus groaned, his face buried deep in the high thread-count pillows. His head throbbed with the dull ache of a man who had celebrated his own arrogance a little too hard. He blindly reached out his hands, slapping against the wood, until his fingers closed around the cold metal frame of his phone. He squinted against the blinding glare of the screen. His blurred vision slowly focused on a cascading waterfall of red notification banners. They were stacked one on top of the other, an endless stream of digital alarms that made his blood run cold. The first message was an automated alert from his primary domestic bank. It read, "Account frozen. Please contact your branch administrator immediately." Marcus blinked hard, rubbing his eyes, convincing himself it was a glitch. He swiped to the next notification. This one was from his exclusive offshore wealth management firm, a secure account that was supposed to be completely untraceable. The message was identical: "Account suspended pending compliance review." His heart began to hammer against his ribs. The lingering fog of his hangover vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp metallic taste in his mouth. He sat up abruptly, the silk sheets pooling around his waist. His fingers flew across the screen, frantically tapping the banking app he used to monitor his liquid assets. The loading circle spun for 3 agonizing seconds, before flashing a stark white error screen. Access denied. Panic, raw and visceral, began to claw at his throat. He opened his encrypted email server, his thumbs slipping in his sudden haste. A message marked with highest urgency sat at the top of his inbox. It was from the chairman of the board of his investment firm, sent at 5:45 this morning. Marcus forced his eyes to track across the harsh black text. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all duties and stripped of your executive authority. The board has been alerted to massive irregularities in your portfolio. Federal authorities have contacted our compliance division regarding alleged wire fraud and illegal shell corporations tied directly to your signature. Furthermore, Vanguard Holdings has initiated a catastrophic withdrawal of all their assets from our firm, citing a breach of trust linked to your accounts. Do not attempt to access the building. Security has been instructed to escort you off the premises. The phone slipped from his trembling hand and tumbled onto the thick carpet. Vanguard Holdings was his anchor. They were the whale client that kept his entire fraudulent empire afloat. Without their capital, his phantom equity would collapse like a house of cards. Worse, the federal authorities were already involved. His mind raced desperately, trying to calculate how this had happened so fast. Just last night, he was the king of Atlanta, untouchable and supreme. Now, before the sun had even fully risen, he was locked out of his own life. He threw off the covers and bolted out of bed. His bare feet slapped against the hardwood floor as he tore out of the master suite. He did not bother throwing on a robe. He was wearing nothing but expensive silk boxers, his chest heaving as he took the grand staircase 2 steps at a time. He almost tripped over the marble landing, his perfectly manicured image completely shattered by raw terror. He stormed into the main living room, his eyes wild and bloodshot. I was already there. I was sitting on the plush velvet sofa, bathed in the soft morning light, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was wearing a simple, comfortable cashmere sweater and holding a steaming mug of black coffee. I looked the picture of absolute serenity. I had been awake for hours watching the digital confirmation of Order 404 executing flawlessly across global servers. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at me, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven gasps. For a split second, I saw the sheer terror in his eyes, the look of a man who realized he was falling without a parachute. But Marcus was a narcissist. His brain could not process personal failure. It was physically impossible for him to accept that he had orchestrated his own destruction. His terror rapidly mutated into blazing, irrational fury, and as always, he aimed that fury directly at me. "You did this!" he snarled, his voice trembling with rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me, closing the distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. "You brought this curse into my house." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the dark roast warm my throat. I did not shrink back. I did not lower my eyes. I simply watched him unravel. "I should never have let you show your face last night," he shouted, pacing frantically in front of the sofa like a caged animal. "You are a jinx. From the moment you walked down those stairs smelling like cheap lotion and looking like a lost maid. Everything went wrong. You humiliated me in front of the board, you made me look weak, and now this." He dragged both hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining it completely. He was spiraling, trying to connect dots that did not exist in his reality. The universe was punishing him, he decided, and it was my fault for infecting his high-class world with my low-class presence. "I need cash," he demanded, stopping abruptly and glaring down at me. His eyes were wide and manic. "Everything is locked. Some glitch, some stupid compliance error with the bank. The firm is overreacting. I just need a bridge loan to hold me over until I can get into the office and scream at the board." He looked at me, expecting me to jump up and start solving his problems. When I did not move, his face turned an ugly shade of red. "Did you hear me, you useless parasite?" he roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I need money. Call those pathetic friends of yours. Call whoever you used to borrow from when you lived in the dirt. Max out those garbage credit cards you had before I rescued you. I need $50,000 in cash by noon to pay off the retainers from my lawyers, or we are going to lose everything." The absolute irony of his demand was delicious. The mighty titan of finance, the man who had mocked my background just 12 hours ago, was now standing half-naked in his living room, demanding that I beg for scraps to save his skin. He was oblivious to the fact that the woman he was ordering to take out a payday loan was the same woman who had single-handedly dismantled his billion-dollar shadow empire. "You are going to lose everything," I repeated, softly emphasizing the pronoun. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the panic he was desperately trying to provoke. He corrected viciously, slamming his fist down on the glass coffee table. The cups rattled violently. "We are going to lose this house. We are going to lose the cars. If you do not get off your lazy behind and find me some cash right now, you are going straight back to the gutter where I found you." I set my coffee mug down on the coaster with practiced care. I looked up at him, my expression utterly placid. He was waiting for me to break, to scramble for my phone, to cry about the prospect of losing the mansion. He thought the threat of returning to poverty would motivate me. He had no idea that I owned the ground he was standing on the roof over his head and the very air he was breathing. I leaned back against the velvet cushions and crossed my legs. I let the silence stretch out, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. I was not going to save him. I was not going to call anyone. I was simply going to sit there and watch the first waves of his personal apocalypse wash over him, enjoying every single second of the view. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like it might snap. Marcus stood panting in the center of the Persian rug, his chest heaving under his silk boxers. He stared at me, waiting for the familiar panic to wash over my face, waiting for me to scramble to my feet and offer a desperate solution. When I did not move, when I simply took another slow sip of my dark roast coffee, something in his expression shifted from rage to sheer disbelief. "Are you deaf?" he screamed, his voice cracking with a frantic edge. "I said I need cash. I need you to make yourself useful for once in your miserable life." He marched over to the side table where he had dumped his belongings the night before. His hands shook violently as he snatched his designer leather wallet. He ripped it open, tearing through the perfectly organized slots until he produced his prized possession. It was his black titanium American Express card, the ultimate symbol of his elite status, the piece of metal he loved to casually toss onto restaurant tables to ensure everyone knew exactly how important he was. He turned and hurled the heavy metal card directly at my face. It missed my cheek by a fraction of an inch, striking the glass coffee table with a sharp, heavy clatter before sliding to a halt right next to my steaming mug. "Call your pathetic friends," Marcus commanded, pointing a trembling finger at the card. "Call anyone. Tell them to run a cash advance. Tell them it is an emergency. I do not care what lies you have to spin. Just get me $50,000 by noon, or we are entirely finished." I looked down at the black card resting on the glass. Then I looked back up at my husband. His hair was sticking up in wild patches. His eyes were bloodshot and a thick vein pulsed frantically at his temple. He looked absolutely pathetic. All the refined aristocratic charm he had paraded around the parlor last night was completely gone, washed away by the first sign of real adversity. I set my coffee mug down on its coaster, the ceramic making a soft thud in the quiet room. I reached out and picked up the titanium card. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the cold weight of the metal running my thumb over the raised numbers. "You actually think this is a glitch?" I said. My voice was quiet, completely even, and utterly devoid of the southern submissive drawl I had used around him for the last 3 years. The sudden change in my cadence made him freeze. He blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the absolute calm radiating from my posture. "What did you say?" he demanded, stepping closer to the sofa. I looked him dead in the eyes. "You think your card is malfunctioning, Marcus. You think Vanguard Holdings pulled their capital because of some clerical error in the compliance department. You think the board suspended you this morning because of a random audit." The color began to drain from his face. His mouth opened but no sound came out. The fact that I knew about Vanguard, the fact that I knew about his suspension before he had spoken a single word about it aloud, hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled back half a step, his bare heel catching the edge of the rug. "How do you know about Vanguard?" he whispered, the manic energy suddenly replaced by a creeping, icy dread. I did not answer his question directly. Instead, I let the titanium card drop from my fingers. It hit the glass table with a dull thud. "Your accounts are not frozen because of a glitch, Marcus. They are frozen because they are entirely empty," I explained, leaning back against the velvet cushions. "In fact, your accounts have been deep in the red for exactly 3 years. You have not been a millionaire, let alone a billionaire, since that week in Las Vegas." Marcus stopped breathing. I watched the realization strike him, paralyzing his entire body. 3 years ago, he had taken a supposed business trip to Nevada. In reality, he had locked himself in a high-roller suite at the Bellagio, desperately trying to double his firm's money to cover up a series of catastrophic investments he had made. He had lost $7 million in 4 days. He had returned to Atlanta, a broken, desperate man, terrifyingly close to facing federal prison for embezzling client funds. Then miraculously, an anonymous offshore trust had acquired his bad debt. An algorithmic trading bot tied to his personal accounts had suddenly started generating massive, consistent returns, effectively filling the massive crater he had dug for himself. Marcus, being a textbook narcissist, never questioned his sudden stroke of good fortune. He convinced himself he was simply a financial genius whose luck had finally turned. He went right back to his arrogant, flashy lifestyle, completely oblivious to the shadow network keeping him out of a federal penitentiary. "How do you know about Vegas?" he asked, his voice shaking so badly the words barely formed. "No one knows about that. I covered it up. I fixed it." "You did not fix anything," I said, allowing a cold, sharp smile to touch the corners of my mouth. "You were drowning, Marcus. You were ready to jump off a bridge. The person who quietly pumped $50,000 a month into your personal accounts, so you could continue playing the role of a self-made billionaire in front of the Atlanta elite was me. He stared at me, his eyes wide and completely uncomprehending. His brain was violently rejecting the information. It went against everything he believed to be true about himself, about me, and about our entire marriage. That is impossible, he stammered, shaking his head rapidly. You did not have a dime when I met you. You were working in a diner. You were living in a shoebox apartment. I rescued you. I pulled you out of the dirt. You pulled a ghost out of the dirt, I corrected him smoothly. The woman you met 3 years ago did not exist. My financial ruin was a fabricated background created by the federal agency I actually work for. I needed a way inside your inner circle. I needed to map the illegal wire transfers you and your brother Trey were running through your church charities. So I created a profile you could not resist. A poor, uneducated, beautiful woman you could easily control and parade around as a trophy of your own generosity. I stood up from the sofa. I was significantly shorter than Marcus, but in that moment I towered over him. I walked slowly around the glass coffee table, closing the distance between us. He did not move. He was rooted to the floor, completely trapped in the terrifying reality of his own destruction. Every single dime you have spent for the last 36 months came from my operational budget, I told him, keeping my voice low and lethal. The bespoke suits you wear to board meetings. The diamond necklace your mother flaunted at the door last night. The fuel for your luxury cars. The very bourbon you wasted by throwing that crystal glass at my feet. It was all funded by the charity case you loved to humiliate. I bought this house through a shell corporation before you even proposed to me. You have been living on my charity, Marcus. You are the ultimate freeloader. The absolute devastation on his face was a masterpiece. I could literally see his ego fracturing into 1,000 pieces. The narrative he had built his entire identity around the powerful, wealthy savior who controlled everyone in his orbit was completely annihilated. He was nothing. He was a puppet who had been dancing on my strings for years, funded by the very woman he abused to make himself feel tall. Last night you wanted to break me down in front of your colleagues. I continued, circling him slowly like a predator examining its prey. You called me useless. You told 50 people I would be drowning in debt without you. But the truth is, without me, you would have been sitting in a federal prison cell 3 years ago. I kept you afloat just long enough to trace every single dirty dollar you and your family ever touched. And now that I have everything I need, I am turning off the tap. I stopped right in front of him, looking up into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. Order 404 is a complete asset seizure. The federal agents are currently raiding your brother's house. Your mother's church accounts have been frozen. Your firm is facing a massive federal indictment. You do not have $50,000, Marcus. You do not even have 50 cents. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I watched the information finally penetrate his thick skull. I watched him realize that his life was completely and utterly over. There was no charm that could save him. There were no favors he could call in. His money was gone, his reputation was destroyed, and his freedom was about to be taken away. For a moment he just stood there, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his ruin. But then the predictable reaction of a cornered narcissist took over. He could not accept the humiliation. He could not process the fact that the woman he viewed as a peasant had completely outsmarted and destroyed him. The terror in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden violent surge of pure animalistic rage. His face contorted into an ugly, hateful mask. He let out a guttural roar, a sound completely devoid of human reason, and lunged directly at my throat. Years of intense tactical training had hardwired my reflexes to respond to sudden violence with devastating efficiency. As his hands reached for my neck, I did not flinch. I did not scream. I simply shifted my weight, stepping smoothly to the left while catching his extended right wrist. Using his own aggressive forward momentum against him, I pivoted sharply and twisted his arm downward in a seamless, fluid motion. He had no time to react. He crashed violently onto the heavy glass coffee table, shattering the thick pane completely before tumbling onto the Persian rug in a pathetic heap of bruised ego and torn silk. I stood over him, smoothing a microscopic wrinkle from the sleeve of my cashmere sweater. I watched as he groaned, spitting a harsh curse as he pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. Blood trickled down his jaw from a small cut on his cheek, where a shard of glass had grazed his skin. He looked up at me, the blind rage in his eyes now fractured by a sudden jarring dose of physical reality. He realized, perhaps for the very first time, that I was not the fragile, defenseless charity case he had spent 3 years breaking down. The woman he thought he owned had just dismantled him without breaking a single sweat. "You are completely insane," he spat, scrambling backward across the rug until his back hit the base of the velvet sofa. He pointed a trembling finger toward the grand mahogany doors of the foyer, trying desperately to reclaim his dominance. Get out. Get out of my house right now. You think freezing my bank accounts changes who I am. I am still Marcus Jenkins. This is my property. My name is on the deed to this estate. I am calling the police and having you arrested for assault and trespassing. Get out of my house immediately. I did not move toward the door. Instead, I walked gracefully over to the leather tote bag I had left resting on a side chair the night before. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. I walked back toward the center of the room, stepping carefully over the broken glass and dropped the heavy folder right onto his lap. Read it carefully, Marcus. I said, my voice echoing softly in the cavernous room. Because your reading comprehension has always been tragically flawed. He looked down at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before his trembling hands tore open the flap. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. His bloodshot eyes darted across the bold black print scanning the crest of the state registry and the notarized seals stamped clearly at the bottom of the pages. I watched his brow furrow in deep confusion as he tried to process the legal jargon while battling the fog of his hangover and the adrenaline of his panic. This is the deed to the estate, he muttered, his voice tight with confusion. He flipped to the second page, his eyes tracing the highlighted sections. It says the property was transferred. It says the title was legally signed over to Apex Investment Group. Exactly, I replied, crossing my arms over my chest and looking down at him. Do you remember 3 years ago, right after we got married, when your offshore accounts were nearly exposed during that massive SEC audit? You panicked. You were absolutely terrified and desperate to shield your remaining hard assets from federal seizure. Your brother Trey suggested you transfer the title of this sprawling mansion into a blind trust, a corporate shell that no government agency could ever trace back to you. You eagerly signed the transfer documents without ever bothering to properly vet the holding company. You thought you were outsmarting the system. He stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked up at me, the denial still fighting a losing battle in his mind. Apex Investment Group. I continued savoring the sharp syllables as they hung in the morning air. It is a highly secure private holding firm based out of Delaware. And guess who the sole anonymous chief executive officer of Apex Investment Group is? The remaining blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. He looked from the notarized signatures on the deed, back up to me, the ultimate truth, finally crushing the last defiant breath out of his lungs. He realized the colossal magnitude of his own stupidity. You, he whispered the word barely scraping past his vocal cords. Me, I confirmed with a slow, deliberate nod. You own absolutely nothing, Marcus. You do not own the luxury cars parked in the garage. You do not own the designer suits hanging in your custom closet, and you certainly do not own this house. You are just a pathetic tenant residing in your wife's property. And quite frankly, considering the phantom funds I have been pumping into your accounts, you are 3 years late on rent. This house had always been his ultimate weapon against me. Every time we argued, every time I dared to express an opinion or stand up for myself, he would quickly remind me whose roof I slept under. He used the imported marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, and the manicured acres as blunt instruments to batter my self-esteem. He loved to host lavish parties, just to show his colleagues his undisputed dominance over his domain. He had spent years treating me like a glorified maid in my own home, ordering me around and threatening to throw me out onto the street whenever I displeased him. Now the reality of his situation was a crushing weight. The illusion of his generational wealth was entirely dead. The emperor was not only naked, but he was also completely broke, facing federal indictment, and technically facing immediate eviction. The expensive artwork on the walls, the imported Italian leather furniture, the custom mahogany shelving, everything he had used to construct his fake billionaire persona, now belonged explicitly to the woman he had relentlessly abused. You tricked me, he gasped, his voice breaking as he clutched the documents to his chest. This is fraud. I will take you to court. I will have my lawyers invalidate this entire transfer. I will destroy you. With what lawyers, Marcus? I asked, tilting my head in mock sympathy. The ones you can no longer afford because your accounts are frozen solid. Or perhaps the ones who are currently ignoring your calls because they are fielding inquiries from federal prosecutors regarding your massive wire fraud. You signed this deed willingly in the presence of a licensed notary. You gifted me this estate to hide it from the government. It was the only smart financial decision you have made in your entire pathetic life, even if you made it by accident. I paced slowly around the ruined coffee table, letting the silence amplify his despair. You wanted me out, I asked, pausing to look down at him. That is a fascinating request coming from a man who is legally squatting on my property. But I am not going to kick you out, Marcus. Not yet. Why, he croaked, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Because I want you to be right here when the federal agents pull up that sweeping driveway, I told him softly. I want you to be standing in the grand foyer you are so incredibly proud of when they put the handcuffs on you. I want you to look around at this beautiful house and know that it belongs to the woman you called a charity case. Suddenly, his entire demeanor shifted. The blistering rage and the suffocating arrogance evaporated, leaving behind something deeply repulsive, pure, unadulterated desperation. He dropped the deed onto the floor and crawled forward on his knees, ignoring the sharp fragments of broken glass that bit into his bare shins. Naomi, please, he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. Please, you cannot do this to me. I am your husband. We are family. I gave you a life. I brought you into my world. You gave me a cover story. I corrected him, stepping backward to ensure he could not touch me. And you gave me a front-row seat to the most arrogant, corrupt, and morally bankrupt family in Atlanta. You do not know what family means, Marcus. You only know how to use people. I can change, he pleaded, reaching out a trembling hand toward my ankle. Tears, genuine tears of terror, began to spill down his cheeks. I can make it right. We can sell the house. We can take the cash and leave the country together. You have the skills. You know how to move money securely. We can go somewhere the feds cannot reach us. We can start over. Just do not leave me here to take the fall alone. I will do whatever you want. I looked down at him, feeling a profound sense of disgust. This was the man who had demanded total submission from everyone around him. This was the titan of finance who stepped on the vulnerable to elevate himself. Now he was a man completely stripped of his armor, offering to abandon his mother, his brother, and his entire supposed empire just to save his own skin. He was willing to flee like a coward and beg for my protection. You are missing the point, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. I am not here to run away with you. I am not your partner, and I am certainly not your savior. I am the architect of your ruin. I am the one who built the cage you are currently sitting in. I am the one who locked the door. And I am the one holding the key. Before he could offer another pathetic plea, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion echoed with a series of sharp, authoritative knocks. The sound was loud enough to rattle the crystal in the chandelier above us. Marcus froze, his eyes darting toward the foyer as the reality of my words finally materialized. The feds were not just coming, they were already here. The digital cascade of Order 404 executed flawlessly across the globe. I spent the remaining hours of the night parked a few blocks away from the estate, watching the secure dashboard on my secondary phone light up with bright green confirmations. Every single one of Marcus Holding Company's offshore accounts and shadow ledgers were being systematically dismantled and frozen. By the time the first rays of dawn began to creep over the Atlanta skyline, the financial empire of the Jenkins family had been reduced to absolute zero. I did not drive away to start a new life just yet. I wanted a front-row seat to the exact moment the illusion shattered. I slipped back into the mansion through the service entrance, moving silently through the grand hallways until I reached the main parlor. I made myself a cup of black coffee and sat on the plush velvet sofa, waiting for the sun to fully rise. Upstairs in the master suite, the heavy, lingering silence of the morning was abruptly broken. The harsh, mechanical buzzing of a cell phone vibrated violently against the polished mahogany nightstand. It was exactly 6 o'clock. Marcus groaned, shifting under the heavy silk sheets. His head throbbed with the dull, suffocating ache of a man who had celebrated his own manufactured brilliance a little too hard the night before. He blindly reached out his hand, slapping against the wood, until his fingers closed around the cold metal frame of his phone. He pulled it toward his face, squinting against the blinding glare of the screen. I expected to see congratulatory texts from his sycophantic colleagues, or perhaps a message from his mother gloating about my departure. Instead, his blurred vision slowly focused on a cascading waterfall of red notification banners. They were stacked one on top of the other, an endless stream of digital alarms that made the blood run cold in his veins. The first message was a high-priority automated alert from his primary domestic bank. It read, "Account frozen. All assets suspended pending federal review. Please contact your branch administrator immediately." Marcus blinked hard, rubbing his eyes, trying to clear the lingering fog of expensive bourbon. He convinced himself it was a technical glitch, a routing error in the system. He swiped to the next notification. This one was from his exclusive offshore wealth management firm, a secure account that was supposed to be completely untraceable. The message was identical. Account disabled. Credit privileges revoked. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm of impending dread. His fingers flew across the screen, frantically tapping the encrypted banking app he used to monitor his liquid assets. The loading circle spun for 3 agonizing seconds before flashing a stark white error screen. Access denied, zero balance available. Panic, raw and visceral, began to claw at his throat. He abandoned the banking apps and opened his secure corporate email server, his thumb slipping in his sudden haste. A message marked with highest urgency sat at the very top of his inbox. It was from the chairman of the board of his investment firm, sent at 5:45 this morning. Marcus forced his eyes to track across the harsh black text. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all duties and stripped of your executive authority. The board has been alerted to massive irregularities in your portfolio. Federal authorities have contacted our compliance division regarding alleged wire fraud and illegal shell corporations tied directly to your signature. Furthermore, our largest cornerstone client has initiated a catastrophic withdrawal of all their assets from our firm, citing a breach of trust linked to your personal accounts. Do not attempt to access the building. Security has been instructed to escort you off the premises if you appear. The phone slipped from his trembling hand and tumbled onto the thick carpet. The whale client was his anchor. They were the singular force that kept his entire fraudulent operation afloat, masking the massive deficits he and Trey had accumulated. Without their capital, his phantom equity would collapse like a fragile house of cards. Worse, the federal authorities were already involved. His mind raced frantically, desperately trying to calculate how this had happened so fast. Just last night, he was the undisputed king of Atlanta, untouchable and supreme. Now, before the sun had even fully risen, he was completely locked out of his own life. He threw off the covers and bolted out of bed. His bare feet slapped against the hardwood floor as he tore out of the master suite. He did not bother throwing on a robe or a shirt. He was wearing nothing but expensive silk boxers, his chest heaving as he took the grand staircase 2 steps at a time. He almost tripped over the marble landing, his perfectly manicured image completely shattered by pure animalistic terror. He stormed into the main living room, his eyes wild and bloodshot, moving with the frantic energy of a man trapped in a burning building. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. I was sitting perfectly still on the velvet sofa, bathed in the soft morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the dark roast warm my throat. I did not shrink back. I did not lower my eyes. I simply watched him unravel. For a split second, I saw the sheer terror in his eyes, the look of a man who realized he was falling without a parachute. But Marcus was a textbook narcissist. His brain could not process personal failure. It was physically impossible for him to accept that he had orchestrated his own destruction. His terror rapidly mutated into blazing, irrational fury, and as always, he aimed that fury directly at me. "You did this!" he snarled, his voice trembling with rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me, closing the distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. "You brought this curse into my house." I remained completely silent, letting his accusation hang in the air. "I should never have let you show your face last night," he shouted, pacing frantically in front of the sofa. "You are a jinx. From the moment you walked down those stairs, smelling like cheap perfume and looking like a lost maid. Everything went wrong. You humiliated me in front of the board. You made me look weak. You tainted my image, and now this." He dragged both hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining it completely. He was spiraling, trying to connect dots that did not exist in his twisted reality. The universe was punishing him, he decided, and it was entirely my fault for infecting his high-class world with my low-class presence. "I need cash," he demanded, stopping abruptly and glaring down at me. His eyes were wide and manic. "Everything is locked. Some glitch, some stupid compliance error with the bank. The firm is overreacting because of a minor audit. I just need a bridge loan to hold me over until I can get into the office and scream at the board." He looked at me, expecting me to jump up and start solving his problems. When I did not move, his face turned an ugly shade of red. "Did you hear me, you useless parasite?" he roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I need money. Call those pathetic friends of yours. Call whoever you used to borrow from when you lived in the dirt. Max out those garbage credit cards you had before I rescued you. I need $50,000 in cash by noon to pay off the retainers from my lawyers, or we are going to lose everything." The absolute irony of his demand was delicious. The mighty titan of finance, the man who had mocked my background just 12 hours ago, was now standing half-naked in his living room, demanding that I beg for scraps to save his skin. He was oblivious to the fact that the woman he was ordering to take out a payday loan was the same woman who had single-handedly dismantled his billion-dollar shadow empire. "You are going to lose everything," I repeated softly, emphasizing the pronoun. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the panic he was desperately trying to provoke. He corrected viciously, slamming his fist down on the glass coffee table. The cups rattled violently. We are going to lose this house. We are going to lose the cars. If you do not get off your lazy behind and find me some cash right now, you are going straight back to the gutter where I found you. I set my coffee mug down on the coaster with practiced care. I looked up at him, my expression utterly placid. He was waiting for me to break to scramble for my phone to cry about the prospect of losing the mansion. He thought the threat of returning to poverty would motivate me. He had no idea that his threats were entirely empty. The heavy oak front doors did not open with the measured tactical precision of a federal raid. They flew open violently, slamming against the foyer walls with a thunderous crash that echoed through the entire mansion. It was not the FBI strike team Marcus was expecting. It was Vivian. My mother-in-law stormed through the grand entryway like an avenging angel. She was dressed impeccably for a Tuesday morning, wearing a pristine white Chanel suit, her signature heavy pearls resting against her collarbone, and her hair sprayed into an unmovable helmet of Southern perfection. But her usual composed matriarchal facade was entirely missing. Her chest was heaving, her eyes were wide with a frantic manic energy, and her hands gripped her expensive crocodile skin handbag so tightly her knuckles were stark white. She had clearly bypassed the front gate, using her emergency access code, driven by whatever financial alarms were currently going off in her own meticulously curated world. She marched into the living room, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. She stopped dead when she took in the scene before her. The massive pane of the custom coffee table was shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. Bourbon and blood stained the expensive Persian rug. And right in the center of the wreckage was her golden boy, her perfect successful son, kneeling in his silk boxers, bleeding from his cheek, and looking utterly defeated. I stood a few feet away looking down at him with an expression of complete indifference. Marcus. Vivian shrieked, the sound tearing through the quiet room. She dropped to her knees, completely ignoring the jagged shards of glass that snagged the pristine fabric of her designer skirt. She grabbed his face, her manicured hands smearing the blood on his cheek. "What happened to you? What has she done to you?" Marcus looked up at her, his eyes vacant and wide with shock. His jaw trembled as he struggled to form a coherent sentence. "Mom, it is gone. Everything is gone. The firm locked me out. The offshore accounts are frozen. The feds are coming." He pointed a shaking, bloody finger at me. "She owns the house, Mom. She owns Apex. She took everything." Vivian turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto me. The maternal panic in her eyes instantly hardened into pure, unadulterated venom. She looked at me with a hatred so deep it was almost tangible. She refused to believe what her son was saying. To Vivian, I was still just the uneducated charity case, the poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks who had somehow tricked her brilliant son into marriage. The idea that I could orchestrate the downfall of the almighty Jenkins family was mathematically impossible in her elitist mind. "You classless, violent thug!" Vivian spat, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. She stood up, pulling her jacket straight and lifting her chin to look down her nose at me. "I knew the moment Marcus brought you home that you would try to destroy us. You are nothing but a gold-digging parasite who could never handle the pressure of living in a respectable high-society family. You think you can throw a tantrum, break some glass, and take what belongs to my son." She stepped over the shattered table, placing herself between me and Marcus. She puffed out her chest, projecting the holy righteous authority she used to command her megachurch congregation every Sunday. "We are the Jenkins family," Vivian proclaimed, her voice rising to a theatrical crescendo. "We are built on a foundation of divine grace, unwavering morality, and generational success. We are untouchable by the likes of you. If you think for one second that some pathetic domestic dispute is going to ruin my son, you are sorely mistaken." She unclasped her crocodile handbag with sharp, aggressive movements. She reached inside and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook and a gold-plated fountain pen. She did not even ask Marcus for the exact details of his financial crisis. She simply assumed that her vast wealth, the wealth she constantly bragged about, could serve as a magic wand to sweep me away. "You want money?" Vivian sneered, her upper lip curling into a sneer. "Is that what this pathetic little shakedown is all about? You realized your little marriage charade was ending, and you decided to extort us. Fine. I will treat you exactly like the common beggar you are." She hastily scribbled across the paper, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. She ripped the check from the binding with a sharp, violent tear and threw it directly at my chest. It fluttered in the air for a moment before landing on the rug right next to Marcus' expired black credit card. "There is $100,000, Vivian announced, crossing her arms and glaring at me. Take it and walk out that door. You are going to leave my son alone. You are going to sign whatever divorce papers my lawyers put in front of you, and you are going to crawl back to whatever miserable poverty-stricken hole you crawled out of." She reached back into her bag and pulled out her smartphone, holding it up like a weapon. And if you even think about arguing, I am calling the senior legal counsel for our church. They are the most ruthless litigators in Atlanta. I will have them file charges against you for assault, destruction of property, and extortion before Sunday service even begins. We will tie you up in court for the rest of your natural life. You will rot in a cell, Naomi. Now take the money and get out. I did not look at the check on the floor. I did not flinch at her legal threats. I simply reached into the pocket of my cashmere sweater and pulled out my secondary encrypted smartphone. The biometric scanner unlocked instantly. I looked at Vivian, a slow, chilling smile spreading across my face. Do you honestly think $100,000 can save him? Vivian, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of an absolute, undeniable truth. Do you really believe that $100,000 embezzled directly from the church youth charity fund is going to make the federal government look the other way? Vivian froze. The righteous indignation melted off her face, instantly replaced by a sudden rigid stiffness. Her hand, still holding her phone, hovered mid-air. What did you just say? She asked, her voice dropping an octave, the southern drawl completely vanishing. I tapped the screen of my phone, bringing up an audio file I had isolated just for this specific occasion. I maximized the volume and pressed play. The crisp, clear audio of a recorded telephone conversation filled the living room. It was Vivian in voice, completely unmistakable. She was speaking to her primary bank manager. Yes, redirect the $30,000 from the weekend tithe collection into the Apex Consulting LLC, he heard her say on the recording. Label it as a pastoral outreach expense. And make sure the building fund for the new orphanage is diverted into the offshore account by Friday. The congregation does not need to see the itemized ledger, just the general summary. I paused the recording. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus looked up from the floor, his eyes darting between me and his mother, complete confusion washing over his face. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a thick blue binder, setting it gently on the only intact corner of the coffee table. This is a complete forensic audit of your megachurch financial history for the last 5 years. Vivian, I explained, leaning forward slightly. You love to stand on that massive stage every Sunday, wearing your designer suits, and preaching about divine provision and moral superiority. You love to look down on the poor and the struggling. But the truth is, you have been bleeding your own congregation dry. I tapped the cover of the binder. You skimmed millions from the Youth Center Building Fund. You took donations meant for disaster relief and funneled them into private shadow accounts to pay for your luxury vacations to Europe. You stole from orphans, Vivian. You stole from the elderly parishioners who gave their last dimes to your ministry, believing you were doing the work of God. You are nothing but a common thief hiding behind a cross. Vivian's mouth opened, but she could not breathe. She was hyperventilating, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow jerks. And that check you just threw at me? I continued, pointing to the piece of paper on the floor. That check is drawn from an account that was flagged by the FBI Cybercrimes Division at exactly 4 o'clock this morning. If you attempt to clear that check, or if you even attempt to log into that account, it constitutes felony wire fraud across state lines. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The absolute authority in my posture made her shrink backward. You threatened to call your church lawyers, I said, my voice cold and hard as steel. You should probably save your battery, Vivian. The federal task force executing Order 404 is not just coming for Marcus. They are coming for the entire Jenkins operation. They are currently staging at the bottom of your driveway. By the time you dial your attorney, the FBI will be kicking down the doors of your precious sanctuary. The pristine, arrogant facade that Vivian had maintained for decades shattered in a single spectacular moment. The reality of her total destruction crashed down upon her. She realized she was not the savior of the Jenkins family. She was just another criminal caught in the exact same net. Her knees buckled. She let out a soft, pathetic whimper as her legs simply stopped supporting her weight. She collapsed onto the floor right next to the shattered glass and her broken son. Her heavy crocodile handbag slipped from her fingers, spilling lipsticks and mints across the ruined Persian rug. She slumped forward, covering her face with her trembling hands, her perfect hair finally falling out of place. I stood over them both, the titan of finance and the first lady of high society, reduced to a pathetic, weeping pile on the floor of a house they did not own. The sirens began to wail in the distance, a faint, high-pitched scream that grew louder and louder, cutting through the crisp Atlanta morning. The illusion was finally dead and the reckoning had arrived. The wail of the sirens had not even reached its peak when a second set of footsteps echoed violently from the grand hallway. The heavy mahogany doors were thrown wide open, and Trey burst into the parlor with his wife Chloe practically stepping on his heels. They had obviously rushed over from their adjacent estate on the compound. Trey was still wearing his silk pajama pants and a wrinkled cashmere pullover, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He knew exactly what frozen accounts meant. But Chloe was an entirely different story. She was dressed in pristine white tennis apparel, complete with a perfectly pleated skirt, and a visor resting neatly on her blonde hair. She looked as though she had just stepped off the cover of a country club brochure, completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse raining down upon her husband. Chloe stopped in the doorway and gasped. Her manicured hands flew to her mouth as she surveyed the absolute carnage of the room. She saw the shattered glass of the coffee table scattered like diamonds across the Persian rug. She saw Marcus bleeding and shivering in his boxers. And she saw Vivian, the untouchable matriarch of the Jenkins family, slumped on the floor weeping into her hands. Her gaze finally snapped to me. I was the only person standing perfectly calm and untouched by the wreckage. In Chloe's limited, intensely privileged reality, there was only one logical explanation for this scene. She assumed I had finally suffered a complete mental breakdown. She thought the pressure of being married to a wealthy, powerful man had driven me to violence. She thought Marcus had finally decided to throw me back into the poverty I came from, and I had reacted like a wild animal. "Oh my God, Naomi!" She breathed, her voice dripping with that sickeningly sweet southern condescension she reserved exclusively for me. "Look at what you have done. You have completely lost your mind." Trey ignored me entirely. He rushed past the broken glass and dropped to his knees beside his mother, grabbing her shaking shoulders. "Mom, what is happening?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a raw, frantic panic. "The bank just called me. My routing numbers are completely dead. The church charity accounts are locked. Who did this?" Vivian could not even form the words. She just sobbed, pointing a trembling finger up at me. Chloe did not understand the gesture. She did not comprehend the sheer terror in her mother-in-law's eyes. Instead, Chloe stepped carefully over the debris, her white tennis shoes avoiding the blood and bourbon. She approached me with the slow, cautious movements of someone trying to pacify a dangerous stray dog. Her face was a mask of deep manufactured pity. "Naomi, sweetie, you need to stop this right now," Chloe said, using the soft, lilting tone of a preschool teacher, reprimanding a toddler. "I know you are upset. I know Marcus is filing for divorce, and I know you are terrified of going back to the projects. But destroying their beautiful home is not the answer. Violence is never the answer." I simply stared at her. Her absolute blindness to the reality of the situation was almost hypnotic. The red and blue lights of the federal vehicles were already beginning to reflect against the sheer silk curtains of the parlor windows, casting frantic dancing shadows across the walls. Yet Chloe was completely captivated by the sound of her own voice, eager to play the role of the benevolent white savior. "You have always been so emotionally unstable." Chloe continued, taking another step closer and tilting her head sympathetically. "We all saw it. We all tried to welcome you into our family, to teach you our values, but you simply lacked the moral foundation. You lacked the grace. And now look at you. You have ruined the greatest opportunity you will ever have." She paused, deliberately lifting her left hand to brush a non-existent stray hair from her forehead. The movement was entirely calculated, designed to flash the massive, flawless diamond ring sitting on her finger. The stone was easily 5 carats, catching the morning light and sending sharp prisms of color dancing across my sweater. "Trey bought this for me just yesterday," Chloe said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, boastful whisper. "To celebrate closing the new commercial property in Buckhead. That is what a healthy, stable marriage looks like, Naomi. We build each other up. We do not act like savage animals tearing apart a parlor when things do not go our way." She dropped her hand and sighed heavily, shaking her head as if mourning a tragic loss. "But because I am a Christian woman," Chloe said, pressing her hands together over her heart, "I am willing to offer you a lifeline. I am willing to show you the grace that you so clearly lack." I tilted my head, mirroring her condescending posture. "A lifeline?" I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "Yes," she replied, eagerly encouraged by my response. "If you drop to your knees right now and apologize to Vivian, if you beg Marcus for forgiveness, and promise to sign a clean annulment, without asking for a single dime of his money, I will personally make sure they do not press criminal charges against you for this horrific assault. I will convince them to let you walk away quietly." She took a deep breath, puffing out her chest as she delivered her final, ultimate act of charity. "And because I know you will have absolutely nothing, I will give you a job," Chloe offered, her eyes wide with fake sincerity. "My lead housekeeper just quit last week. The estate is simply too large for the remaining staff to handle alone. You can come clean for me, Naomi. I will pay you minimum wage under the table so you do not have to worry about taxes. You can scrub my floors and wash my windows. It will give you a sense of honest purpose. It will keep you off the streets. It is the absolute best offer you are ever going to get." I looked at her pristine white tennis skirt. I looked at the massive diamond ring cutting into her finger. Then I looked past her to Trey, who was now frantically shaking his brother, trying to get Marcus to stand up and face the reality of the flashing lights outside. "You want me to clean your house?" I asked, the corners of my mouth turning up into a razor-sharp smile. "It is honest work," Chloe insisted, nodding encouragingly. "It will teach you the discipline you never learned growing up in your environment. You should be thanking me on your hands and knees." The sheer audacity of her delusion was a masterpiece. She was standing in the epicenter of a financial nuclear blast, and her only instinct was to offer me a mop. "Chloe," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air with the precision of a scalpel, "I am not going to clean your house. And the reason I am not going to clean your house is because by this time tomorrow, you are not going to have a house." Her sympathetic smile froze. Her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulled together in a tight knot of confusion. "What are you talking about?" she scoffed, crossing her arms and jutting out her hip. "You are making absolutely no sense. You are delirious." I did not break eye contact. I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out a second folder. This one was far thinner than the forensic audit I had dropped on Vivian, but its contents were infinitely more devastating for the woman standing in front of me. I tossed the folder onto the only remaining intact section of the coffee table directly in front of her. "That is a copy of the federal indictment bearing your husband's signature," I stated, watching her eyes track the movement of the folder. "Trey has been using the church youth charities to launder money for a cartel operating out of Miami. He created 7 shell corporations to wash the cash, funneling it through the same offshore accounts Vivian used to hide her stolen tithes." Chloe let out a sharp, breathless laugh, a sound of pure denial. "You are lying. Trey is a brilliant investor. He builds communities." "Trey is a glorified money mule," I corrected her sharply. "Every single cent he used to buy that Buckhead property was dirty. Every dime he spent on those designer tennis skirts you love to wear was stolen. And that 5-carat diamond ring you just shoved in my face." I paused, letting my eyes drop to her hand before snapping back up to her terrified face. "That ring was purchased with funds diverted from a pediatric cancer charity." "You are wearing stolen charity money on your finger, Chloe," she gasped instinctively, pulling her left hand behind her back, as if the ring had suddenly caught fire. She looked frantically over her shoulder at Trey. "Trey, tell her she is lying," she demanded, her voice pitching into a shrill, hysterical squeak. "Tell this crazy woman she is lying." But Trey could not look at her. He was staring at the front windows, watching the federal agents in tactical gear pouring out of black SUVs and forming a perimeter around the estate. The heavy thud of combat boots marching up the front steps echoed through the foyer. "Trey," Chloe screamed, rushing over to him and grabbing his arm. "Tell me she is lying." Trey slowly turned his head to look at his wife. His face was the color of ash. His eyes were completely hollow, entirely devoid of the smug superiority he had carried for years. "We are ruined, Chloe," he whispered, his voice breaking into a dry, ragged sob. "She gave them everything. The ledgers, the routing numbers, the encrypted emails. She gave the feds everything." Chloe stumbled backward as if he had physically struck her. She looked from Trey to Vivian to Marcus, and finally back to me. The perfectly constructed reality she had lived in for her entire adult life simply dissolved. The country club memberships, the luxury vacations, the undeniable sense of social superiority, all of it vanished into thin air. She looked down at her hands, staring at the massive diamond ring. Her chest began to heave, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps. The realization that she was no longer a wealthy socialite, but the wife of a federally indicted money launderer, hit her with the force of a freight train. She was going to lose the estate. She was going to lose the cars. She was going to be the absolute laughingstock of Atlanta high society. "You," Chloe stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me, her pristine facade completely collapsing into an ugly, distorted mask of panic. "You cannot do this. We are good people. We go to church. We donate to the poor. We are respectable." "You are a parasite, Chloe," I said, throwing her exact insult right back at her. "You have lived your entire life feeding off the misery and exploitation of others. You loved to look down on me because it made you feel tall. You loved to offer me your scraps because it fed your savior complex. But the truth is, you are nothing without the stolen money funding your delusion." I took a step closer, forcing her to back up until she bumped into the edge of the velvet sofa. "So keep the ring, Chloe," I whispered, leaning in, so only she could hear me over the sound of the heavy fists pounding on the mahogany front doors. "You are going to need it to pay for a decent defense attorney. Because when the FBI is done seizing your assets, you will not even have enough money to buy a mop." The heavy oak doors of the foyer burst open with a deafening crash, followed immediately by the booming, authoritative shout of federal agents securing the perimeter. "FBI, nobody move, keep your hands where we can see them." Chloe let out a piercing, terrified shriek and dropped to her knees beside her husband and her mother-in-law. The three of them huddled together on the floor of the ruined parlor, a pathetic portrait of fallen aristocracy. They were weeping, they were trembling, and they were completely and utterly powerless. I stepped back smoothly, blending into the shadows near the grand fireplace, allowing the swarm of armed agents to flood the room and surround the Jenkins family. My work here was finally done. Years of intensive tactical training had hardwired my reflexes to respond to sudden violence with devastating mechanical efficiency. As his hands darted desperately toward my neck, I did not flinch, and I certainly did not scream. I simply shifted my weight, stepping smoothly to the left, while catching his extended right wrist. Using his own aggressive forward momentum against him, I pivoted sharply and twisted his arm downward in a seamless, fluid motion. He had absolutely no time to react or correct his balance. With a strangled gasp, Marcus pitched forward, his heavy frame crashing violently into the edge of the velvet sofa before he tumbled awkwardly onto the Persian rug. A decorative crystal lamp on the side table wobbled dangerously before tipping over and shattering into 100 glittering pieces across the hardwood floor. He lay there in a pathetic, tangled heap of bruised ego and torn silk, groaning as the wind was knocked completely out of his lungs. I stood over him, calmly smoothing a microscopic wrinkle from the sleeve of my cashmere sweater. I watched as he pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, spitting a harsh curse. A thin trail of saliva mixed with a drop of blood from a bitten lip ran down his chin. He looked up at me, the blind rage in his bloodshot eyes now fractured by a sudden jarring dose of physical reality. He realized, perhaps for the very first time in our 3-year marriage, that I was not the fragile, defenseless charity case he had spent years trying to break down. The woman he thought he owned had just dismantled him without breaking a single sweat or raising her heart rate. He scrambled backward, his bare heels slipping on the polished wood until his back hit the base of the living room wall. His chest he heaved, and the thick veins in his neck bulged against his skin. The physical defeat had only poured premium gasoline on the blazing fire of his wounded pride. He could not accept that he had been outsmarted, outplayed, and now physically overpowered by someone he viewed as a peasant. He needed to reclaim his territory. He needed to assert his dominance in the only way a pathetic coward knew how. His hands curled into tight, trembling fists, and he screamed, his voice cracking and echoing wildly off the vaulted, custom-painted ceilings. "Get out of my house immediately. This is a mansion with my name on the deed. I want you out of my sight before I call the police and have you dragged out of here in handcuffs for trespassing and assault." I did not flinch at his shouting. His threats were nothing more than the desperate, hollow thrashing of a cornered animal caught entirely in a trap of its own making. I turned my back to him, demonstrating my absolute lack of fear, and walked gracefully over to the leather briefcase I had left resting on the wingback chair near the grand fireplace. The room was deathly quiet, save for the sound of his ragged, uneven breathing and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. I unclasped the heavy brass locks of the briefcase, the sharp metallic clicks cutting through the thick tension in the air. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder. The paper was heavy-stamped with official state registry seals and bearing multiple notarized signatures. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of his absolute ruin. I turned back around and walked slowly toward him, my heels clicking a steady, terrifying rhythm against the floorboards. I stopped right in front of him, looking down at his pathetic, trembling form huddled against the wall. I did not hand the envelope to him. I simply let it drop from my fingers. It landed on the glass surface of the coffee table right in front of his face, with a heavy, definitive thud. "Read it carefully, Marcus," I commanded, my voice cold, unyielding, and utterly lethal. His eyes darted from my face down to the thick envelope. He hesitated, his hands shaking violently as he reached out and peeled back the reinforced flap. He pulled out the thick stack of registered documents, his eyes immediately scanning the bold legal print at the top of the first page. I watched the deep confusion wash over his features as his brain struggled to process the complex legal jargon while still clouded by blind panic and the lingering fog of expensive bourbon. "Let me translate the fine print for you." I continued, my tone mocking the condescending aristocratic drawl he loved to use on his subordinates. "This house belongs to Apex Investment Group. It has belonged to them for the last 2 years. And guess who the anonymous chief executive officer of Apex Investment Group is?" The remaining color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen shade of gray. His eyes widened to the point of tearing, fixing entirely on my name, Naomi Jenkins, printed clearly and boldly under the executive authorization line on the 3rd page of the deed. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords completely failed him. You see, Marcus, 2 years ago, when your firm was facing that massive federal audit regarding those highly illegal offshore wire transfers, you were absolutely terrified. You were desperate to protect your remaining hard assets from being frozen and seized by the government. Your sleazy defense attorneys advised you to immediately transfer the title of this sprawling $30 million estate into a blind trust. They told you to hide it in a corporate shell company that no federal agency could ever trace back to your signature. I took a slow step closer, enjoying the sheer terror radiating from his body. You eagerly signed the property transfer deeds thinking you were a financial genius, brilliantly outsmarting the justice system. You never even bothered to properly vet the holding company because you were far too arrogant to believe anyone could ever pull a fast one on you. You literally gifted me this entire estate to hide it from the very federal agency I actually work for. He stared at the paper, his hands trembling so badly, the thick parchment rattled loudly in the quiet room. His eyes darted frantically across the signatures, recognizing his own messy scrawl, right next to the corporate seal of Apex Investment Group. The absolute truth was finally crushing the last defiant breath out of his lungs. He realized the colossal, unforgivable magnitude of his own stupidity. The trap had been sitting in plain sight for years, and he had gleefully walked right into it, locking the door behind himself. For 3 years he had used this magnificent house as his ultimate weapon against me. Every single time we argued, every time I dared to express an opinion or stand up for my basic human dignity, he would quickly and viciously remind me whose expensive roof I slept under. He had used the imported Italian marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, and the manicured acres of landscaping as blunt instruments to constantly batter my self-esteem. He loved to host lavish, ostentatious parties just to show his elite colleagues his undisputed dominance over his domain and his trophy wife. He had spent years treating me like a glorified disposable maid in my own home, ordering me around and threatening to throw me out onto the street with absolutely nothing whenever I displeased him. Now the terrifying reality of his situation was a crushing, suffocating weight. The grand illusion of his generational wealth and untouchable power was entirely dead. The emperor was not only naked, but he was also completely broke, facing federal indictment, and technically facing immediate eviction from a property he had paid to maintain. "You own nothing," I stated, my voice echoing with finality in the cavernous room. "You do not own the fleet of luxury cars parked in the climate-controlled garage. You do not own the custom designer suits hanging in your massive closet, and you certainly do not own a single brick of this mansion. You are just a pathetic tenant living in your wife house, and quite frankly, Marcus, you are exactly 3 years behind on rent." He dropped the legal documents onto the floor, his entire body going slack as the fight completely drained out of him. The expensive artwork on the walls, the imported leather furniture, the custom mahogany shelving, everything he had used to construct his fake powerful billionaire persona now belonged explicitly and legally to the woman he had relentlessly abused. He was destitute, he was exposed, and he was entirely at my mercy. The heavy oak doors of the foyer burst open with a deafening crash, instantly shattering the chaotic tension in the room. "FBI, nobody move, keep your hands where we can see them." A dozen heavily armed federal agents in dark tactical gear flooded into the grand parlor. Their heavy combat boots trampled over the shattered glass of the coffee table, crushing the remaining shards deep into the expensive Persian rug. The sheer kinetic violence of their entry sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the air. Vivian let out a sharp, terrified shriek and threw her arms over her perfectly styled hair, cowering on the floor like a frightened child. Marcus froze his hands, raised his body, trembling violently in his silk boxers. Chloe stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the velvet sofa and collapsing onto the cushions, her pristine white tennis outfit suddenly looking absurdly out of place in the epicenter of a federal raid. Trey stood completely paralyzed, his face devoid of all color, his eyes wide with a primal, animalistic panic. A tall, broad-shouldered man, wearing a dark windbreaker with the letters FBI emblazoned in bold yellow across the back, stepped through the tactical formation. He was the lead special agent in charge of Order 404. His sharp, calculating eyes swept over the pathetic scene of the fallen Jenkins family, before finally landing on me, standing quietly in the shadows near the grand stone fireplace. "Agent Miller," he said, giving me a firm, respectful nod. "The perimeter is fully secured. The primary targets are detained. Your operational cover is officially terminated. Excellent work, Naomi." The sound of my real title, echoing from the mouth of a federal agent, hit the room like a physical shockwave. The 4 members of the Jenkins family snapped their heads toward me, their expressions contorting from sheer terror to absolute mind-bending shock. Their brains simply could not process the data. The woman they had humiliated, marginalized, and treated like a disposable peasant for 3 years was not just an informant. I was a fully credentialed federal agent who had systematically dismantled their entire criminal empire from the inside out. You, Chloe whispered, her voice trembling so violently the syllables barely held together. You are one of them. You set us up. You ruined my life. You ruined my family. The agents moved swiftly through the parlor, ordering Marcus and Trey to remain exactly where they were, while they began reading the federal search warrants and seizing their personal electronic devices. The grand mansion was suddenly filled with the chaotic symphony of a synchronized raid. Drawers were being pulled open upstairs. Hard drives were being confiscated from the home office. The illusion of their high society sanctuary was being systematically torn down to the studs. Yet even as her husband was being read his Miranda rights, Chloe could not let go of her twisted, arrogant delusion. She glared at me, tears of fury streaming down her face, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. You are a monster, Chloe hissed, her hands gripping the velvet cushions. I offered you grace. I offered you a job cleaning my home so you would not starve on the streets, and this is how you repay us. You are just jealous. You are jealous of my marriage. You are jealous of our wealth. I stepped away from the fireplace, walking slowly toward the center of the parlor, entirely ignoring the tactical teams moving around us. I stopped right in front of Chloe, looking down at her with a gaze so sharp and piercing it made her physically flinch. Clean your house, Chloe, I asked, my voice echoing with a cold, lethal calm that cut through the noise of the raid. I am genuinely curious. How exactly were you planning to pay me my wages? Were you going to use the commercial real estate startup fund your husband manages? Chloe lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with a pathetic, defiant pride. Yes, because my husband is a brilliant provider. He builds real wealth unlike you. I let out a short, humorless laugh. He is a brilliant provider, Chloe. I will certainly give him that. But he is not providing for you. Are you completely unaware that Trey quietly drained every single cent of that startup fund over the last 2 years? He did not invest it in Buckhead commercial properties. He used it to fully finance his 22-year-old mistress in Miami. The air in the parlor vanished. Chloe's mouth dropped open. She blinked rapidly, her brain violently rejecting the words. Trey's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with a fresh, terrifying panic that had absolutely nothing to do with the federal agents standing behind him. Shut up! Trey yelled, lunging forward slightly before an agent pressed a heavy hand onto his shoulder, forcing him back down. Do not listen to her, Chloe. She is lying. She is a federal agent. They lie to manipulate people. She is trying to break us apart. I did not bother arguing. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of folded documents. These were not government files. These were personal. I tossed the heavy stack of paper directly into Chloe's lap. Read them, I commanded. Those are the shadow credit card statements your brilliant husband has been desperately hiding from you for 24 months. He bought her a luxury condo in South Beach. He bought her a brand new Range Rover. He spent $40,000 on her shopping sprees in Milan while you were sitting here at the country club, bragging to your friends about your perfect, stable marriage. He washed the cartel money to fund your extravagant lifestyle, and he stole from the church to fund hers. Chloe's hands shook uncontrollably as she picked up the stack of papers. She stared at the highlighted line items. The charges from luxury jewelers in Florida. The monthly maintenance fees for a beachfront penthouse. The first-class airline tickets booked under Trey's name, and a woman named Isabella. The heavy reinforced denial that had shielded Chloe for years finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The pristine, white-painted facade of her elite upper-class existence was completely annihilated. She was not the beloved trophy wife of a successful tycoon. She was a loud, obnoxious distraction while her husband spent their stolen wealth on a woman 10 years younger than her. A guttural, inhuman scream erupted from Chloe's throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated primal rage. She threw the bank statements into the air and lunged across the velvet sofa. She threw herself entirely at Trey, her perfectly manicured nails curling into vicious claws. She slammed into his chest, knocking him backward onto the floor. You disgusting, pathetic liar! Chloe shrieked, her hands tearing wildly at his face and his hair. I gave you everything. I defended you to my family. You swore you were working late. You swore you were building our empire. You were spending my money on some cheap Miami trash. Trey raised his arms, trying desperately to shield his face from his wife's frantic, violent blows. Get off me, you crazy witch! He roared, shoving her hard against the side of the coffee table. You think this is my fault? You spent $60,000 a month on clothes and spa treatments. You demanded a new luxury car every year. You drained my legitimate accounts dry before we even hit our first anniversary. I had to take loans from the Miami cartel just to keep you swimming in champagne and diamonds. You drove me to this. You are a bottomless pit of greed. The physical brawl between the supposedly perfect couple ignited a chain reaction of pure venomous hatred across the room. The grand illusion of family loyalty evaporated, leaving only cornered, desperate rats fighting for survival. Marcus, who was still kneeling in the broken glass, turned his blazing, bloodshot eyes toward his mother. He pointed a shaking, bloody finger at Vivian, who was still sobbing hysterically on the floor. "And what about you?" he screamed, his voice cracking with absolute malice. "You sat on $10 million of stolen church charity funds while I was facing federal prison. I came to you 3 years ago. I begged you for a loan to cover my margin calls. I told you I was drowning, and you told me to pray about it. You let me squander client money to save my firm, while you used the orphanage building fund to buy real estate in Europe. You could have saved me. You let your own son take the fall while you hoarded the collection plate. You are the reason I am going to jail." Vivian Head snapped up, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of ugly, self-righteous fury. She slapped her hands against the floor, her heavy pearl necklace swinging wildly against her chest. "Do not you dare blame your incompetence on me, Marcus Jenkins." She spat, her voice echoing with the harsh judgment of a scorned matriarch. "I built an empire in the name of the Lord. I created a legacy. And what did you do? You locked yourself in a high-roller suite at the Bellagio and lost $7 million on blackjack and cheap liquor. You are a degenerate. You have always been a weak, pathetic boy, masquerading as a man. I had to protect the ministry from your stupidity. You deserve to rot in a federal cell for dragging my good name into the mud." Trey pushed Chloe off his chest, scrambling backward away from her scratching fingernails. "You are all insane," Trey yelled, pointing wildly between his mother and his brother. "You dragged me into this. You told me the offshore accounts were untraceable. Mom, you told me the holding company was secure. Marcus, you both used me to clean your dirty money, and now my life is over. I am giving the feds everything I have on both of you. I am testifying against my own family to cut a deal." "I will testify first," Marcus roared, struggling to his feet despite the watchful eyes of the armed agents. "I will give them the entire ledger for the church. I know exactly where the European accounts are hidden. Mom, I will sell you out in a heartbeat to save myself." Vivian let out a piercing, theatrical wail, throwing her hands toward the ceiling as if begging heaven for an intervention that was never going to come. "My own sons," she cried dramatically. "Vipers, I raised vipers who would betray their own mother." Chloe was still screaming on the floor, clutching her 5-carat diamond ring and sobbing about her ruined social standing, entirely ignoring the fact that her husband was about to face 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, retreating completely into the shadows near the cold stone fireplace. I crossed my arms over my chest and leaned my shoulder against the wall. The federal agents did not intervene. They simply stood in a secure perimeter, forming a silent, impenetrable wall around the chaotic feral scene. They let the family completely devour itself. There was no one left for them to blame. There were no more helpless victims for them to exploit. The luxurious, pristine white paint of their high society facade had cracked, peeled, and violently fallen away, exposing the rotting, termite-infested wood beneath. They were tearing each other apart, limb by limb, entirely consumed by their own greed, arrogance, and cowardice. I watched the dramatic final act of the Jenkins family play out with absolute perfect clarity. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm of total satisfaction. The punishment for their crimes was not just the handcuffs that the agents were currently pulling from their tactical belts. The true punishment was this exact moment, the absolute irreversible destruction of their false reality. The sweet, flawless symphony of my revenge was finally complete. The heavy oak doors of the foyer burst open with a deafening crash, followed immediately by the booming, authoritative shout of federal agents securing the perimeter. "FBI, nobody move. Keep your hands where we can see them." It took exactly 6 hours for their ruthless defense attorneys to secure a temporary release on bail. The lawyers had to leverage the absolute last remaining drops of their unseized collateral just to get Marcus and Vivian out of the federal holding facility. A normal family possessing even a shred of sanity would have retreated into hiding, covering the windows and preparing for the legal bloodbath to come. But the Jenkins family was not normal. Denial was woven into their very DNA. By 8 o'clock that evening, they were attempting the most desperate, pathetic masquerade of their entire lives. The annual Atlanta Elite Fundraising Gala was the crown jewel of the Southern social calendar. Held in the grand ballroom of the historic Biltmore Hotel, the event was a glittering spectacle of old money, high fashion, and ruthless networking. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of champagne. A string quartet played softly in the corner. It was the exact room where fortunes were made and destroyed with a single handshake. Marcus and Vivian stepped out of a rented black car since their own fleet was currently sitting in an FBI impound lot. They had scrambled to put themselves back together. Vivian was wearing a vintage emerald green gown from a decade ago, her hair sprayed into a rigid helmet to hide the frantic tremors in her hands. Marcus wore his tailored tuxedo, but the fabric hung strangely on his frame, as if the events of the morning had physically shrunk him. His jaw was tight, his eyes darting frantically around the room. They had not come to donate to charity. They had come to beg. They needed a lifeline. They needed liquid capital to bridge Marcus' frozen margins and to silence the church board before the sealed federal indictments became tomorrow morning front-page news. They believed that if they could just secure a massive private loan from one of their old partners, they could somehow buy their way out of the apocalypse. Vivian grabbed her son's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging sharply into his tuxedo jacket. She spotted their target near the towering ice sculpture. "Straighten your spine, Marcus," she hissed through a forced frozen smile. "There is Arthur Sterling. He is the chairman of the City Investment Committee. He manages over $2 billion in municipal funds. If we can get him to authorize an emergency bridge loan, we can quiet the feds and untangle the routing numbers. Do not look desperate. We are the Jenkins family. We are simply offering him an exclusive opportunity." Marcus swallowed hard, adjusting his bow tie. He took a deep breath, attempting to channel the arrogant swagger that used to come so naturally to him. He marched across the ballroom with his mother gliding flawlessly at his side. Arthur Sterling was a formidable man with silver hair and cold, calculating eyes. He was deep in conversation with a group of banking executives when Marcus and Vivian aggressively inserted themselves into the circle. "Arthur, it is so wonderful to see you," Vivian purred, laying on her southern charm, so thick it was practically suffocating. "The gala is simply beautiful this year. We were just discussing how vital the City Investment Committee is to our community growth." Arthur turned, looking at them with a polite but distinctly guarded expression. Rumors were the lifeblood of Atlanta high society, and whispers of the morning raid were already beginning to leak through the cracks. "Vivian." Marcus Arthur said, his tone carefully neutral. "I was not expecting to see you here tonight. I heard there was some commotion at your estate this morning, something about federal vehicles." Marcus let out a sharp artificial laugh, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "A complete misunderstanding, Arthur. A minor clerical error regarding some outdated tax filings from a subsidiary shell company. My lawyers already cleared it up. In fact, I am glad we ran into you. I have a highly lucrative commercial portfolio opening up next week. It requires a significant initial capital injection, but the returns are guaranteed to double your municipal fund projections within 6 months. I am offering you the ground floor." Arthur swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, his eyes narrowing. "You want me to authorize a city investment fund into your portfolio tonight, Marcus? That is highly irregular, and frankly, given the rumors circling about your liquidity, I am not sure that is a prudent move." Vivian stepped closer, invading Arthur's personal space. "We are talking about a temporary cash flow adjustment, Arthur," she insisted, her voice dropping into a desperate conspiratorial whisper. "The Lord tests all of his strongest soldiers. We are offering you a chance to partner with divine generational wealth. We just need a bridge loan. $5 million to clear some administrative hurdles by Monday morning. I will personally guarantee the loan against the church assets." Arthur's expression hardened instantly. "You want to leverage your congregation tithes to secure a municipal loan, Vivian? That borders on insanity. I am sorry, but I think this conversation is over." Before Arthur could turn his back on them, the heavy classical music echoing through the ballroom abruptly cut off. The sudden silence was deafening. The low hum of 100 wealthy socialites murmuring over champagne died instantly. People paused mid-sentence, turning their heads in confusion. The massive crystal chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling slowly dimmed, plunging the opulent room into a dramatic theatrical shadow. Vivian grabbed Marcus' arm, her breath catching in her throat. "What is going on?" she whispered, the panic bleeding back into her voice. "Did they cut the power?" A single brilliant white spotlight pierced through the darkness. The beams swept across the crowded ballroom, illuminating the sea of confused faces, before snapping directly onto the top of the grand marble staircase that overlooked the entire venue. A tall, imposing figure stepped into the light. It was not the hotel manager. It was not the charity director. It was me. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the absolute cream of Atlanta elite. I was not wearing the modest, practical clothes I had worn for the last 3 years. I was draped in a custom-tailored crimson silk gown that hugged every curve and swept the floor with undeniable authority. My hair was styled in sleek cascading waves, and my posture radiated the cold, absolute power of a woman who held the entire room in the palm of her hand. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I could see the exact moment Marcus and Vivian spotted me. Even from 50 feet away, I could see the remaining blood drain completely from their faces. Marcus took a physical step backward, nearly knocking over a waiter. Vivian's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. The master of ceremonies stepped up to a microphone near the base of the stairs. His voice boomed through the silent ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced, his tone ringing with deep respect. "We have a very special adjustment to tonight's program. We would like to introduce the evening anonymous primary benefactor. Please welcome the new majority shareholder and chief executive officer of Apex Investment Group, Miss Naomi Jenkins." The applause that erupted was thunderous. The elite of Atlanta did not know the intricate details of my marriage. They only knew the title the host had just spoken. Chief Executive Officer of Apex Investment Group. They knew that whoever held that title controlled one of the most massive real estate portfolios in the state. They were clapping for the very wealth and power that Marcus and Vivian were currently trying to fake. I began my descent. I walked down the sweeping marble staircase with slow, measured precision. The spotlight tracked my every movement, making the crimson silk of my gown practically glow in the dim room. I did not look at the applauding crowd. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Marcus and Vivian. The crowd naturally parted for me as I reached the ballroom floor, creating a wide, clear path directly to where my husband and mother-in-law stood frozen in shock. Arthur Sterling stepped aside, watching the scene unfold with keen, calculating interest. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from them. The applause slowly faded, dying out as the surrounding guests sensed the radioactive tension radiating between us. Naomi Marcus choked out, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "What are you doing here? How did you get in here?" I smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of an apex predator looking at its trapped prey. "I bought the table, Marcus," I replied, my voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet of the immediate circle. "In fact, I bought the entire VIP section. It is amazing what you can afford when you are not actively laundering money for a cartel." Vivian's face twisted into a mask of pure desperate rage. "You evil, vindictive snake," she hissed, taking a step forward. "You think you can parade around here in an expensive dress and destroy our reputation? I will tell everyone in this room exactly who you are. I will tell them you are a federal rat." I tilted my head, raising a single perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Please do, Vivian," I challenged, stepping right into her personal space. "Tell them. Tell Arthur Sterling exactly who I am. Tell him that I am the federal agent who seized your bank accounts this morning. Tell him that the only reason you are standing in this ballroom right now is because you liquidated your last hidden retirement fund just to post bail." Arthur Sterling let out a sharp, shocked breath, stepping even further away from Marcus. "You are out on federal bail," Arthur demanded, his voice rising in outrage. "You approached me for a municipal loan while you are under federal indictment." "Arthur, please," Marcus begged, turning to the older man with his hands raised in surrender. "It is a setup. She framed us. We are innocent." But Arthur was not listening. He was looking at me. "Miss Jenkins," he said respectfully. "Is this true?" I did not break eye contact with Marcus as I answered. "It is entirely true, Mr. Sterling. Marcus Jenkins and his mother are currently the primary targets of an active federal racketeering and embezzlement investigation. All of their legitimate assets have been frozen. The only thing they have left to their name is the rented tuxedo he is currently wearing." The whispers erupted around us like a swarm of angry hornets. The surrounding guests began pulling out their phones, typing frantically. The social execution was happening in real time. The Jenkins family was being publicly stripped of their armor in front of the exact people they desperately needed to impress. Marcus' jaw trembled. He looked around at the judging, staring faces of his former peers. He saw the disgust, the pity, and the total social rejection. He looked back at me, his eyes filling with tears of pure, pathetic defeat. "Why are you doing this?" he whimpered, his voice cracking. "You already took the house. You took the firm. What more do you want from me?" I took one final step closer, dropping my voice so only he and Vivian could hear the absolute finality of my words. "I want you to feel exactly what it is like to be entirely powerless," I whispered. "I want you to look around this room and realize that you are nothing. You are a fraud, Marcus, and the show is finally over." I stepped back, leaving Marcus breathless and shaking, as the grand double doors at the top of the marble staircase swung open once more. A synchronized team of 6 elite corporate attorneys, dressed in immaculate midnight blue suits and carrying thick leather briefcases, descended the steps. The crowd parted, instantly recognizing the most ruthless litigation firm on the East Coast. They did not stop until they reached the ballroom floor, forming a flawless, intimidating wall of legal armor directly behind me. Arthur Sterling, the powerful chairman of the City Investment Committee, whom Marcus had been desperately begging for a lifeline just minutes ago, stepped out from the circle of stunned banking executives. The cold, calculating look in Arthur's eyes was completely gone. As he approached me, the undisputed king of Atlanta municipal wealth did the unthinkable. He stopped, buttoned his tailored jacket, and offered me a deep, respectful bow. The collective gasp from the surrounding elite was so sharp it sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. Arthur reached out and took the microphone from the paralyzed host. He turned to face the hundreds of wealthy socialites, his voice booming with absolute, unwavering authority. "Ladies and gentlemen!" Arthur announced, his gaze sweeping over the silent, captivated audience before locking onto Marcus. "It is my distinct honor to clarify the guest list for this evening. You are not just looking at the CEO of Apex Investment Group. Please show your utmost respect for Naomi Jenkins, the senior managing partner of the Federal Forensic Accounting Syndicate." A shockwave rippled through the glittering crowd. "And to be completely transparent," Arthur continued, a sharp, merciless smile cutting across his face, "she is the woman who, as of 3 o'clock this afternoon, personally orchestrated the hostile takeover and absolute liquidation of the Jenkins corporate portfolio. She now legally owns every single remaining fraction of Marcus Jenkins' debt." Marcus stood completely paralyzed. His hand, which had been gripping a crystal flute of expensive red wine, suddenly went entirely numb. His fingers uncurled. The heavy crystal slipped from his grasp and plummeted toward the polished marble floor. The glass shattered with a sharp, violent crash, sending a spray of dark red wine splashing across the tips of his rented tuxedo shoes. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the dead silent ballroom. He stared down at the broken glass, his mind finally breaking under the catastrophic weight of the truth. I had not just frozen his accounts. I had not just orchestrated a raid on his home. I had bought his entire existence for pennies on the dollar. Every debt, every defaulted loan, every single outstanding margin call was now legally owed directly to me. I was his judge, his jury, and his absolute financial executioner. Vivian clutched her chest, her knees buckling as she swayed dangerously in her vintage emerald gown. She reached out, trying to grab her son's arm for support, but Marcus was completely catatonic. He slowly lifted his head, looking at the phalanx of elite lawyers standing behind me, and then looking at the city's most powerful financial chairman standing respectfully at my side. He realized with absolute crushing certainty that there was no loophole, no hidden account, and no powerful friend left to call. His empire was dead, and I was holding the deed to the graveyard. I stepped back from his trembling figure, allowing the lead attorney of my syndicate to hand me a thick, leather-bound folder. I opened it slowly, making sure the agonizing sound of the turning pages echoed in the dead silence of the ballroom. As of this exact moment, a comprehensive forensic audit of all Jenkins family holdings is actively underway, I announced, projecting my voice so every wealthy investor and socialite in the room could hear the absolute destruction of his legacy. Marcus, your position within any corporate entity absorbed by Apex Investment Group is terminated immediately. Your remaining corporate assets, offshore accounts, and domestic properties are officially seized to satisfy the mountains of fraudulent debt you have accumulated. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic strangled gasp escaped his throat. He was a hollow shell of the arrogant tycoon he had spent his entire life pretending to be. I turned my gaze to Vivian, who was clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the string looked ready to snap. "And as for your divine generational wealth, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. "The church board held an emergency session exactly 20 minutes ago. They did not need a federal subpoena to make their decision. They only needed the comprehensive digital dossier of your offshore wire transfers, which my team generously emailed to every single registered parishioner in your congregation." Vivian let out a sharp, horrified shriek. "You sent my private financial records to the congregation," she wailed, her pristine social mask dissolving into pure primal panic. "They are not your private records, Vivian. They are stolen charity funds," I corrected sharply. "You have been officially stripped of your church membership. You are no longer the beloved matriarch. You are just a common thief who stole from orphans to buy designer gowns." Before Vivian could unleash another theatrical scream, the heavy brass doors of the ballroom swung open. A team of federal agents clad in dark windbreakers stepped into the opulent space. At the center of the tactical formation walked the lead agent, and beside him, looking entirely defeated and already wearing heavy steel handcuffs, was Trey. They had intercepted him attempting to flee the jurisdiction and brought him directly to the venue to process the brothers together. Marcus Jenkins, the lead agent, announced, his voice cutting through the glittering room like a scythe. Your temporary bail is officially revoked due to new evidence of severe tax evasion and international wire fraud. Place your hands behind your back. Two agents moved with ruthless efficiency, grabbing Marcus by the arms and spinning him around. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed through the Biltmore Hotel. He did not fight. He simply let his head fall forward, completely broken. From the back of the crowd, Chloe pushed her way through the circle of executives. She took one look at her husband in chains and her brother-in-law being hauled away by federal authorities, and her entire delusion shattered. She did not scream or demand to speak to a lawyer. Chloe's knees buckled. She collapsed directly onto the cold marble floor, her pristine designer dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She wept with loud, ugly, uncontrollable sobs, her manicured hands covering her face in total absolute humiliation. There was not a single trace of her former arrogance left. The elite society of Atlanta watched in stunned silence as Marcus and Trey were marched out of the grand ballroom in matching federal chains. Vivian stood completely frozen, staring blankly at the shattered glass on the floor, while Chloe continued to weep pitifully at my feet. The invincible empire they had built on lies, greed, and stolen money had been completely eradicated, and I was the one holding the match. The deafening echoes of federal handcuffs and Chloe's pathetic sobbing slowly faded away, dissolving into the absolute pristine silence of my present reality. I closed the final case file on my mahogany desk and let out a long, steady breath. The Jenkins family was finally gone. Marcus and Trey were currently navigating the brutal daily reality of a 20-year federal prison sentence. Vivian was a total social pariah living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, entirely excommunicated from the congregation she had ruthlessly exploited. Chloe had filed for a rapid, messy divorce the exact moment the asset freezes were made permanent, completely abandoning the husband she once proudly claimed built real wealth. I pushed my chair back and stood up, the soft fabric of my clothes brushing against the imported hardwood floor. The air in my penthouse was cool, fresh, and perfectly still. There was no one here to demand my service, no one to belittle my existence, and absolutely no one to remind me of my supposed place in their twisted, toxic hierarchy. I walked slowly across the expansive living room toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the entire top floor of the building. Below me, the vibrant, glittering skyline of Atlanta stretched out endlessly into the dark night. The city lights pulsed like millions of tiny, brilliant diamonds, a sprawling empire of glass and steel that I now navigated entirely on my own terms. I pressed my palm lightly against the cool glass, looking down at the very streets where the Jenkins family once thought they ruled as untouchable royalty. Their arrogance had been their ultimate undoing. Their absolute refusal to see the quiet, observant woman standing in the shadows of their grand parlor had been the fatal flaw in their criminal design. They thought my silence was submission. Years ago, when Vivian had humiliated me in front of her country club friends, when Marcus had casually threatened my livelihood, and when Chloe had literally thrown a glass of wine at my feet, expecting me to drop to my knees and clean it up, they mistook my composure for cowardice. They thought that because I did not scream fight back or defend myself in the heat of their daily abuse, it meant I was weak and defeated. They fundamentally failed to understand a basic lethal truth about survival. When a woman is pushed entirely to the wall, she does not cry. She calculates. She memorizes the blueprints of your empire, she tracks every hidden account, and she waits patiently for the absolute perfect moment to strike. I watched my own reflection in the glass superimposed over the brilliant city lights. There were no traces of the frightened, desperate informant left in my eyes. There was only the calm, unwavering gaze of a woman who had meticulously dismantled her abusers and claimed her own absolute freedom. The heavy chains of their manipulation were broken forever. As the perspective slowly pulled back, drifting seamlessly backward through the glass and out into the cool night air, it captured a single flawless image. I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of the city, completely at peace, surrounded by the wealth I had built with my own brilliant mind, and wonderfully perfectly free.